Sarah Mitchell sat in her cramped Chicago apartment, the hum of city life buzzing outside the window, when the letter arrived. The neat handwriting on the envelope felt oddly formal, and the name on the return address stopped her cold. Eleanor Mitchell, her grandmother. But Eleanor had passed away 2 weeks ago. Inside was a letter from an attorney informing Sarah she had inherited the family home by Willow Lake in Minnesota. The house, described as a modest yet historic property, had been in the Mitchell family for 3 generations. The note closed with a cryptic line: "It is time you understood your family's place at Willow Lake." The news jolted Sarah from the autopilot of her life. At 35, she had carved out a successful career as a marketing executive, but it came at the cost of personal connections. Her relationship with her grandmother had been distant, strained by time and geography. The house, she remembered vaguely, was an old Victorian structure nestled by a lake she had visited only once as a child. But what choice did she have? Let the place rot? Sell it unseen? Something about the letter and that haunting last sentence compelled her to go. A week later, Sarah arrived at Willow Lake, her car kicking up gravel as she turned onto the overgrown driveway. The house stood against the backdrop of a slate-gray sky, its weathered shutters clinging stubbornly to the peeling facade. Towering willow trees lined the property, their spindly branches stretching toward the murky lake beyond. Stepping out, Sarah was struck by the oppressive quiet. No car horns, no chatter, only the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. The house exuded a strange duality. Its familiar silhouette tugged at her childhood memories, but its current state, the sagging porch, the broken wind chime hanging lopsided by the front door, spoke of abandonment. Inside, the air was stale, laced with the faint aroma of lavender sachets and something metallic. Dust covered the antique furniture, but the house wasn't in total disrepair. Her grandmother's presence lingered in every detail, from the carefully arranged bookshelves to the old-fashioned rotary phone on the hall table. Yet it was more than nostalgia. An undercurrent of unease prickled her skin, as if the house itself were holding its breath. That night, Sarah found an old photo album in the study, its pages filled with black and white images of Eleanor as a young woman standing by the lake. In one picture, a small group posed near a rickety dock, their smiles forced, their eyes shadowed despite the sunlight. Something about the photos disturbed Sarah, though she couldn't pinpoint why. Before bed, she wandered to the window and stared out at the lake, its glassy surface reflecting the moonlight. A single willow tree bent low at the water's edge, its gnarled roots half submerged. Sarah felt an odd pull toward the lake, a sense of both dread and curiosity. But tonight, the house demanded her attention. As she drifted into sleep, a faint sound echoed through the halls, a creaking, rhythmic, and deliberate, as though the house were alive and testing her. The next morning, Sarah awoke to sunlight filtering through thin floral curtains. The eerie stillness of the house was less oppressive in the daylight, but it was far from comforting. After a quick breakfast of stale granola bars she'd brought along, she resolved to explore the house more thoroughly, taking stock of the life she'd unexpectedly inherited. She began with the living room, a space dominated by an ornate fireplace and a wall of bookshelves stuffed with dusty tomes and knickknacks. Each item seemed deliberately placed, as though her grandmother had tried to preserve moments of her life in objects. Sarah found herself inexplicably hesitant to touch anything, as if disturbing these artifacts might unravel the careful balance the house maintained. As she moved through the rooms, subtle signs of neglect began to emerge. A water stain snaked down one wall in the upstairs hallway, and the air in the back rooms carried a damp, earthy scent. In the attic, she discovered a trunk filled with faded clothes and brittle letters tied with ribbon. The words in one letter caught her eye. "Do not trust the lake, it does not forgive." The sentence sent a shiver down her spine, and she quickly replaced the letters, unsure if she wanted to know more just yet. Later that afternoon, as Sarah unloaded boxes from her car, an elderly man appeared at the edge of the property. He stood at the fence line, leaning heavily on a wooden cane, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of a battered hat. "Morning," he called, his voice gravelly but carrying easily across the yard. Sarah walked over cautiously, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Hi there, I'm Sarah Mitchell." "I know, sir. I am. Home with you." "Uh-oh," he replied. "Tom Harris. Your grandmother mentioned you once or twice." His gaze flickered toward the lake, then back to Sarah. "Didn't think you'd come back here." "Neither did I," she admitted. "I'm just figuring things out." Tom nodded, his expression unreadable. Figure quick. The lake don't take kindly to dawdlers. Sarah frowned. What does that mean? He didn't answer, just gave a low chuckle that sounded more like a wheeze. You'll see, he said, turning to walk away. Watch your nights here, Miss Mitchell. The encounter left Sarah unsettled. She watched Tom shuffle back to his cabin, the trees swallowing him up as if the forest itself were complicit in his cryptic warning. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself drawn to the lake. The narrow trail leading down to the water was framed by dense foliage, the shadows growing longer as she walked. The air felt cooler by the lake, the stillness broken only by the occasional splash of fish breaching the surface. The water was dark, its depths impenetrable even under the waning sunlight. Near the shore, the skeletal remains of an old dock jutted into the water, its boards warped and uneven. Sarah walked carefully to the end, the wood creaking ominously under her weight. She stared out at the expanse of water, noting the way it seemed unnaturally still despite the breeze. As her gaze shifted, she thought she saw something move beneath the surface, a shadow long and sinuous. She froze, her pulse quickening, but when she looked again, it was gone. She told herself it was just a fish, though her instincts whispered otherwise. On her way back to the house, Sarah felt the weight of the lake behind her as though it were watching her retreat. When she reached the yard, she glanced back one last time. The lake sat serene and untouched, but the ancient willow tree by the shore seemed to have shifted ever so slightly, its branches bending toward her like gnarled fingers reaching for something they couldn't quite grasp. That night, as Sarah settled into bed, Tom's words echoed in her mind. Watch your nights here. She turned off the light and stared into the darkness, listening to the silence stretch. Then just as she began to drift off, she heard it again. The faint creaking noise coming from somewhere deep within the house. The creaking persisted through the night, slow and deliberate, like footsteps hesitant yet purposeful. Sarah lay in bed, clutching the blanket, her breath shallow. When the noise finally stopped, an oppressive silence filled the house, heavier than the creaks had been. She didn't sleep. By morning, exhaustion clung to her, but so did a growing determination to understand what was happening. This house and the lake were keeping secrets, and she wasn't leaving until she unearthed them. Sarah's day began with small but unnerving anomalies. The doors refused to stay latched. She'd close them firmly, only to find them ajar moments later. The antique wall clock in the living room stopped at 3:15 every afternoon, its pendulum swaying even as the hands refused to move. The attic trap door, which she was sure she had shut, hung open slightly, as though beckoning her. Then came the voices. Faint, like a radio tuned to a distant station, they murmured just out of clarity. Sometimes they seemed to drift from the walls, other times from the direction of the lake. Sarah convinced herself it was her imagination, a product of stress and too little sleep, but deep down she knew better. That afternoon, she ventured into her grandmother's study, a room she'd avoided until now. It was cramped but meticulously organized, the bookshelves lined with leather-bound journals and yellowed papers. On the desk lay a journal, its leather cover cracked with age. Sarah opened it carefully, her fingers brushing the fragile pages. The entries began innocuously, lists of gardening tasks, notes about visits from neighbors. But as she read on, the tone shifted. Eleanor described strange happenings, objects moving on their own, lights flickering despite clear skies, and a growing sense of being watched. The entries became more fragmented, darker, mentioning the lake's pull and an unnamed debt. One entry stood out. Tom came by again today, rambling about what we owe, said the lake remembers. But I've done all I can to keep it quiet. It's not my fault what happened to her. The lake chose. Sarah read the line repeatedly, her stomach nodding. Who was her? And what debt could her grandmother have owed to a lake? Sarah decided she needed answers, and Tom Harris was the only person who might provide them. She found him sitting on his porch, whittling a piece of wood with a knife that gleamed in the late afternoon sun. You know something about my grandmother and the lake, she said bluntly. Tell me. Tom didn't look up. Eleanor should have told you herself, he said, his voice low, but she was too proud, too scared. Scared of what? Sarah demanded. Tom's knife paused mid-slice. He finally met her eyes, his expression grim. The lake takes what it's owed, he said. Always has. Your family, Bastem, they've been part of it longer than you know. Tom sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. You're asking the wrong questions, Miss Mitchell. It ain't about what the lake wants, it's about what it keeps. He stood abruptly, shuffling inside without another word. That night, Sarah's sleep was plagued by vivid dreams. She stood on the dock, the lake unnaturally still around her. The moon cast a pale glow, and in the water's reflection, she saw figures, not her own, but others, their faces obscured. They stood silently, staring at her. When she turned to face the lake, the water began to ripple, and a hand, slender, pale, and impossibly long, reached up from the depths, grasping for her. Sarah woke with a pain, her heart pounding. The house was dark and silent, but the dream left her shaken. As she sat up, trying to steady her breath, she glanced at the door to her room. It was open. She was certain she had closed it before going to bed. In the faint light spilling from the window, she thought she saw a shadow move across the hallway. But when she got up and peered out, there was nothing there, only the sound of the wind rustling the willow trees outside. The sense of unease tightened its grip on her. The house, the lake, and the fragments of her grandmother's life, all of it pointed to something far darker than she had imagined. She wasn't sure if she was uncovering the truth or slipping deeper into its grasp. The days that followed blurred together, each one heavier than the last. Sarah's once logical, measured mind now spun with fragments of her grandmother's journals, Tom's cryptic warnings, and her own escalating sense of dread. The lake was no longer just a body of water. It was alive, its presence inescapable, reaching into every corner of her life at Willow Lake. Determined to piece things together, Sarah explored the property's outskirts. Hidden beneath the overgrowth, she discovered an old boathouse that seemed to have been abandoned for decades. Its door hung askew, revealing a decayed interior. Rotting wooden beams, rusted tools, and scraps of fabric torn and scattered like confetti. Amid the debris, she found a tattered journal tucked inside a waterproof satchel. Unlike her grandmother's meticulous handwriting, this journal was scrawled hastily, almost illegible in places. It belonged to someone named Margaret, a name she didn't recognize, and it was dated 1953. The entries were unsettling, describing vivid nightmares, whispered voices, and growing paranoia about the lake. One passage stood out. "I see them at night, standing in the shallows. They call to me, but I won't go. Eleanor said it's the only way, but I don't believe her. I won't give them what they want." Margaret's journal ended abruptly. The last page was splattered with water stains and smeared ink, but Sarah could make out two words repeated over and over: "It watches." Desperate for some sense of normalcy, Sarah called Emily Thompson, a close friend from her life in Chicago, to visit. Emily was skeptical of Sarah's growing fear, but agreed to come for the weekend, insisting some company would do her good. The first day of Emily's visit was uneventful, filled with laughter and shared memories over wine. For the first time since arriving, Sarah felt a sliver of relief. But that night, as the two sat on the porch overlooking the lake, Emily grew quiet, her gaze fixed on the water. "Do you hear that?" Emily asked suddenly. Sarah listened, her stomach tightening. The sound was faint at first, like a low hum, but it grew louder, resolving into what sounded like a woman softly humming a lullaby. It seemed to come from the lake. "Probably the wind," Sarah lied, though her voice betrayed her unease. Emily stood and took a step toward the lake, her face blank, her movements almost robotic. "Emily, stop!" Sarah grabbed her friend's arm, pulling her back toward the house. The humming stopped instantly, as if it had never been there. Emily blinked, confused. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You tell me," Sarah said, her own fear barely contained. The incident left Sarah shaken but resolute. She couldn't ignore the lake's pull anymore. That night, she sat at the kitchen table, poring over her grandmother's journals and Margaret's cryptic writings. Was it all a shared delusion? Or had the women in her family been guarding a truth too terrible to name? As the hours ticked by, the noises in the house grew louder. The creaking of floorboards, the distant sound of a door slamming, and a rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Sarah tried to focus, but her eyes kept drifting to the window. Outside, the lake shimmered under the moonlight, and there, standing at the edge of the water, was a figure. It was too far to make out clearly, but its silhouette was unmistakable. A woman, motionless, staring at the house. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears. She blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving only the dark, endless expanse of the lake. The next morning, Emily left abruptly, citing an emergency at work. Sarah knew better than to press her, The lake had worked its way into her friend's mind too. Alone again, Sarah stood at the edge of the property, staring at the water. The lake wasn't just holding secrets. It was daring her to uncover them. And whatever it kept hidden, it was growing bolder, inching closer to pulling her under. Figuratively or literally, she couldn't yet tell. By now, Sarah felt more like a trespasser than an owner in her own home. The house's creaks seemed more intentional, the shadows lingered longer, and the lake's presence loomed larger each day. She was no longer sure where reality ended and fear began. But one thing was clear: there was a connection between her family, the lake, and the eerie events surrounding her. She spent hours poring over Eleanor's journals and Margaret's fragmented writings, piecing together scraps of history. The words pointed to a singular, terrible event, though the details remained elusive. She needed answers, and she knew exactly where to find them. Sarah returned to Tom Harris's cabin, this time with a fire in her eyes. She pounded on the door until he opened it, his expression one of weary resignation. "Tell me everything," Sarah demanded, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Tom sighed, motioning for her to sit. His cabin was cluttered with old tools, books, and an overwhelming number of candles, as if he'd prepared for a permanent power outage. "It's not the lake you're fighting," Tom said after a long silence. "It's the people who thought they could control it." "What does that mean?" Sarah asked. Tom rubbed his temples, his gaze distant. "Your grandmother, Eleanor. She wasn't just keeping this place alive. She was keeping it quiet. Years ago, she and some others, they thought they could make a deal with the lake, a way to protect the land, the family. But the lake doesn't bargain, it takes." Sarah's breath caught. "Takes what?" Tom's eyes met hers, dark and unflinching. "Lives, and it never forgets." He explained that decades ago, a tragedy had struck the community. A girl named Margaret had drowned in the lake under mysterious circumstances. Some claimed it was an accident. Others whispered it was something far darker. Eleanor and a handful of others had conspired to cover up what happened, believing they could appease the lake's wrath. But the lake didn't forgive. It started with whispers, strange dreams, things moving in the night, Tom said. By the time they realized what they'd unleashed, it was too late. Sarah returned to the house, her mind racing. The pieces were starting to fit together, but they painted an even darker picture than she'd imagined. She searched through the attic again, this time determined to find more clues. Beneath a loose floorboard, she uncovered a wooden box. Inside were photographs, documents, and a weathered necklace with a pendant shaped like a willow tree. One photograph showed Eleanor standing with a group of people, including Tom, by the lake. In the background, Sarah noticed something odd: a pale, blurred figure in the water, as though someone had been moving beneath the surface. Beneath the photo was a letter addressed to Sarah's mother, who had died when Sarah was young. It read, "If you're reading this, it means I've failed. The lake's hold on us is stronger than I thought. Margaret wasn't the last, and I fear she won't be the end. Protect Sarah. Keep her away from the water. She is the key, and the lake knows it." The words chilled Sarah to her core. Her grandmother had been trying to shield her from the truth. But why? That night, a violent storm rolled in, battering the house with rain and wind. The lake roared in the distance, its waves crashing like a living thing struggling to break free of its bounds. Sarah couldn't sit idle any longer. She grabbed a flashlight and ventured outside, the rain soaking her instantly. The pull toward the lake was stronger than ever, an invisible force guiding her steps. At the water's edge, she saw a figure standing in the shallows. It was a woman, her face obscured by wet hair. "Margaret?" Sarah called out, though the name felt foreign on her lips. The figure turned and Sarah gasped. It wasn't Margaret, it was Eleanor, or something that resembled her. Her grandmother's face was pale and lifeless, her eyes dark pits. "You shouldn't have come back," the figure said, its voice a distorted echo of Eleanor's. Before Sarah could respond, the figure lunged toward her and the ground beneath her feet gave way. She plunged into the freezing water, the weight of it pulling her down. As she struggled, shadows swirled around her, shapes that looked like hands clawing at her arms and legs. Just as she thought she would drown, she felt herself yanked upward. Gasping for air, she looked up to see Tom standing on the dock, his hands gripping hers. "You can't fight it," he yelled over the storm, "but you can end it. The house, the lake, They're bound together. You have to choose. Tom's words hit her like a lightning strike. The house, her family's legacy, was tied to the lake's darkness. To stop the lake, she might have to destroy the very thing her grandmother had tried to protect. As the storm raged on, Sarah knew she had to make her decision before the lake claimed her for good. The storm reached its peak as Sarah stood on the dock, the freezing rain mixing with the lake's icy spray. Tom's words rang in her ears. The house, the lake, they're bound together. You have to choose. The house, her family's legacy, represented generations of memories, struggles, and secrets. But now Sarah understood that it also anchored the lake's darkness, feeding its hold on the land and on her. To break the lake's power, she might have to sever her connection to everything she thought she was reclaiming. Sarah staggered back to the house, her clothes dripping and her heart pounding. Her decision wasn't clear, but she knew she had to act. She rummaged through the study, gathering anything flammable, old journals, yellowed papers, and the loose curtains from the window. She hesitated only when she came across the photograph of Eleanor standing by the lake. Even in the faded image, her grandmother's expression was one of resolve and of guilt. Lightning illuminated the house as Sarah dragged the materials to the fireplace. She doused them with lighter fluids she'd found in the shed and struck a match. The fire roared to life, consuming the journals and papers, the flames licking higher as if fueled by the lake's wrath. The house groaned, its old beams cracking as the fire spread. Outside, the storm seemed to intensify, the wind howling like a living thing, but the lake, for the first time, was silent. As the fire consumed the study, Sarah felt the floor shift beneath her. The walls trembled, and the oppressive weight she'd felt since arriving seemed to lift, replaced by a strange lightness. She barely made it out before the house collapsed into a smoldering ruin, the flames casting flickering shadows on the restless trees. Sarah stood at the edge of the yard, watching as the fire's glow reflected on the lake's surface. At first, the water was still, eerily calm, but then ripples began to spread outward from the center, as though something beneath the surface was stirring. The ripples grew into waves, and Sarah stepped back, her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she thought she saw the figure of a woman standing in the water, Margaret, or perhaps Eleanor. But as the flames subsided, the figure dissolved, leaving only the dark expanse of the lake. The storm died as quickly as it had come. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke and rain, but the oppressive weight of the lake's presence had lessened. The whispers and shadows that had haunted Sarah since her arrival were gone. Tom appeared at her side, his face somber as he looked at the ruins of the house. "You did what she couldn't," he said after a long silence. Sarah didn't respond. She stared at the lake, her thoughts churning. The house was gone, but the lake remained, a dark, silent witness to generations of secrets and sacrifices. "I'm selling the land," she said finally, her voice steady. "Someone else can deal with it." Tom shook his head. "It's not that simple. The lake doesn't just disappear. It'll find another way, another person. You might have stopped it for now, but it doesn't forgive. Not entirely." Sarah didn't argue. She'd done what she could, but she couldn't stay. Not after everything the lake had taken. Months later, Sarah stood in her Chicago apartment, staring at the papers finalizing the sale of the Willow Lake property. The buyers, an optimistic young couple, had gushed about turning the land into a peaceful retreat. Sarah didn't have the heart to warn them. As she slid the papers into an envelope, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was a photo, grainy and poorly lit, but unmistakable. The lake, still and dark, with a figure standing at its edge. Beneath it was a single word: remember. Sarah dropped the phone, her hands trembling. She rushed to the window, her pulse pounding. Outside, the city lights twinkled harmlessly, but for a moment she thought she saw a shadow moving across the street, a silhouette too familiar to ignore. The lake might have released her, but its presence lingered, and she knew deep down that it always would. The events at Willow Lake left Sarah irrevocably changed. Though she had returned to the bustling anonymity of Chicago, the shadows of the lake and the ruins of her family home clung to her like a second skin. The final act of her journey wasn't about confronting the lake anymore. It was about living with what it had revealed. Sarah had spent her life believing she was self-sufficient, detached from her family's history and the weight of their legacy. But the lake forced her to confront the cost of isolation. The quiet of Willow Lake, though oppressive, had been a mirror for her own loneliness, a haunting reminder of what happens when connections are severed and secrets fester in silence. Back in the city, she found herself drawn to people in a way she hadn't been before. She reconnected with friends she had let slip away, reached out to distant relatives, and even began therapy to process what had happened. Yet, no matter how deeply she immersed herself in connection, she couldn't fully shake the feeling that she was being watched, as though the lake's tendrils still reached her, even miles away. The house on Willow Lake had been a symbol of her family's resilience, but also of its guilt and complicity. Her grandmother's journals, Margaret's fragmented accounts, and Tom's cryptic warnings painted a picture of a family bound by duty and fear. By destroying the house, Sarah had severed the physical ties to that legacy, but the emotional weight lingered. Every so often, she found herself dreaming of Eleanor, her face pale, her voice a faint echo. In the dreams, her grandmother didn't reproach her for burning the house. Instead, she whispered cryptic messages that Sarah could never fully remember upon waking. One phrase, however, always lingered: "The lake never forgets." Sarah began to question whether her grandmother's efforts had been misguided or necessary. Had Eleanor truly been complicit in the lake's darkness, or had she been a reluctant guardian, trying to contain its power the only way she knew how? The lack of clear answers gnawed at Sarah's resolve. The lake, with its serene surface and unfathomable depths, had been a constant reminder of nature's duality, breathtakingly beautiful and utterly indifferent. What had happened at Willow Lake wasn't the result of malice or revenge, but something more primal. The lake didn't want, it simply took. It was a force like the storm or the fire, and Sarah was just another ripple in its endless history. Even after she left, she couldn't look at water the same way. The sight of a river or a quiet pond would send her heart racing, her mind flashing back to the figures she thought she'd seen beneath the surface, the whispers she'd heard in the wind. Months after selling the property, Sarah received a letter in the mail. There was no return address, but she recognized the handwriting immediately. Eleanor's. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper, aged and fragile. "The lake has always been there. It doesn't need us, but we need it. Be careful, Sarah. The debt is never paid, it's only passed on." Her hand shook as she folded the letter, unsure if it was real or some cruel joke. She had done everything she could to escape the lake, but now she understood. Escape was never an option. The lake wasn't tied to the land or the house. It was tied to her blood, her history, her very existence. That night, as she prepared for bed, Sarah heard a familiar sound. It was faint, barely perceptible beneath the city's hum, but it sent ice through her veins. The rhythmic creak of footsteps on old wood, like the dock at Willow Lake. She turned toward the window, but there was nothing outside. Only the empty street, bathed in the cold glow of a streetlight. Yet, as she crawled into bed, she swore she heard a voice, soft and distant, whispering her name. The lake had let her leave, but it hadn't let her go, and it never would.